Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles. Jeannie laid back on the dock beside the lake. The water felt cool on the fingers of the hand that draped over the edge. Clouds hovered overhead, slowly making their journey over the hills that rose steeply on either side of the lake. She was in another world, far from the rat race in the city, away from the constant demands of sniveling actors and prima donna musicians that came to perform on her stage. She was also far from Kyle. She didn't quite know what to think of that realization. She was sure she loved Kyle, but he was such a workaholic. He could never find time to get away, and his schedule was so rigid she just didn't feel like their time together was a priority. This little getaway with Steve was just what she needed. What could Kyle do to her anyway? Divorce her? Oh well. She looked over at Steve. He stood on the shore, with his back turned to her, curling dumbbells in the sun as he completed his morning workout. Muscles rippled up and down his back, his huge arms glistening with sweat. Steve had been a college football star, before injuring his knee. Now Steve ran a local health club chain, and kept his body in this rippling lean state. He had been smart about his father's money, and hired a manager who invested his money in real estate. Who cared that he was dumb as could be about everything except money? He couldn't hold a conversation about anything except football and bodybuilding, but when he swept her into his embrace it was like something out of a dime novel. She swooned when he lifted her and carried her to the bed. So, he was a little small in the department where most men measure themselves for comparison. He still made up in his scales with his tongue and his money. Okay Kyle, she mused, divorce away. We have no kids to hurt, and look what I'll wind up with. I'll be married to Mr. Universe. That makes me Mrs. Universe. I'll trade in a dusty theater for a gym where I can work out when I want, or sit around ogling bodybuilders in tights all day if I prefer. She couldn't wait for his call. A call that might never come. She remembered how Kyle took the news when she told him that she is going out to spend the next week with Steve. How she will be having sex with him all the week and how she will better off with a rich young stud than a loser like him. She had half expected a process server to track her down here with divorce papers anyway. She picked up herself for the 100th time today, just to make sure it was working and ready for his call. The battery was charged. There was a full signal, thanks to that convenient cell phone tower she spied up on the hilltop. The ringer was on loud, but there were no calls from Kyle. They hadn't called her from work, as she had arranged this vacation week months ago. No calls from Kyle. A week after you gave a one-line response, you made your bed, I hope you will sleep well in it. It was a clear message that he was determined to leave her. How can you threaten someone's and then not call for a week? Yet here it was Friday, and nothing from Kyle. She sat up on the dock. Her naked body glowed with a week's worth of sunning all afternoon, and touring different wineries and sampling different taverns each night. She loved the Finger Lakes. The evening sun cast such a beautiful glow on everything here. Why had Kyle always insisted on vacationing at the cottage on the Cape? No crowds here, no teeny bopper beaches, just the quiet solitude of the woods. Call again. She couldn't break free from thinking of him. Why hadn't he called? It was so strange. She sat up and called her home number. The message service answered. It was aggravating to hear a recording of her own voice answer. She left a message in Kyle's box that she'd be home early Sunday, and they could talk then. When she hung up, she sat pensively with the phone still in her hand. Maybe there would be no divorce. Maybe Kyle was scared and would roll over and beg her to come home, just too proud to call maybe. Yes, he'd do better from now on. Cook clean and keep her in the manner befitting a goddess. Ah yes, Kyle the cuckold would serve her every whim, while she ran off to enjoy the fabulous body of her stud Steve. Of course, after Steve swept her off her feet and served her with his talented tongue, she could always go home and have Kyle fill her throbbing but empty glory hole with that big, beautiful till of his. She'd make him beg. Kyle should be home. If he was angry, why hadn't he called? And if he wasn't angry, what was he feeling? She knew he didn't have a show this weekend. He wasn't home. He hadn't called in a week. He hadn't even sent a text. This was very strange. He was robbing her of the argument she had been rehearsing in her mind since she left. She wanted this fight. She wanted to see his passion, and he wasn't even satisfying her with it now. She called home again, and this time keyed in the code to her personal message box instead of the general family box. It was full. There were frantic calls from neighbors, from Kyle's mom, and most disturbingly several from a detective Porter. Apparently, Kyle had been badly hurt. Apparently, his injury had attracted police attention. Oh my. Her mind raced, but eventually focused back on the last time she had seen Kyle. She remembered how Kyle had tears in his eyes as she told him that he is no longer the only man in her bed. She looked at him with disdain and told him to man up and stop the tears. Steve stood snickering quietly in the doorway. It caused her to grin as well. Be a man. Let me go. If he doesn't measure up, I'll be back next week, and we can talk. She told Kyle, trying to cheer him up. If you leave, everything will change. There's no going back to where we were. Kyle said while wiping the last tear in his eye. She grabbed her bag and went out the door. I'll be right there, said Steve. I just got something to say to this little whip. As Jeannie sauntered to the car, Steve walked up behind the cell in Kyle. Steve's massive arm sent his fist hurtling towards the back of Kyle's skull. The beating was short but uneventful. Since the first blow had smashed Kyle's face into the baseboard, he was unconscious from the start. He didn't feel Steve kicking his gut or pummeling him with his fists. He didn't feel his spleen rupture, his bones break. Steve wanted to leave a memory of intense pain for Kyle to wake up to. He left without closing the door, got in the car with Jeannie, and headed north to the lake. Jeannie smiled the entire trip. She remembered meeting Steve last winter. Kyle had always stayed so trim and fit with his running, boxing, and high physical level at work. She, however, had plumped up a bit, and though not fat, looked much closer to 40 than her husband of the same age. She joined Steve's gym and contracted him as her trainer. She could still remember the way he had first filled her up in the hot tub when they were the only two there. She had been so enamored by the attention she had let Steve take her upstairs to his apartment, and they drilled wildly all night. It had been like nothing she had experienced with Kyle. Though Steve's tool was smaller than Kyle, he was so vigorous in its use he was an animal in bed. Kyle had been on a trip to supervise a touring troupe of his latest show in Chicago, and was away for a week. He even called her and spoke tenderly of how he missed her that first night at the very moment Steve was sliding in and out of her. Steve came in, spewing his seed into her just as Kyle was hanging up with a tender, "I love you." Jeannie's body spasmed as she whispered, "I love you too," though really not directing her words at Kyle, but at Steve. She did Steve in every imaginable way that week, until Kyle arrived home that Sunday too weary from travel to make love. It was a good thing. Jeannie woke from her daydream worried. She worried about Kyle's condition, because she really did still love him. She also worried about the ominous message Detective Porter had left, asking her to contact him regarding the matter of Kyle's beating. He wasn't calling to inform her of the attack. It sounded more like something she should already be aware of. She saw the hulking figure of Steve finishing his workout with chin-ups on a low-hanging branch. "Steve, what did you mean when you said it was taken care of?" He was defeated. Steve looked up. "What do you mean?" "Last Friday, at my house, when we left, and you came out of the house after me, you said, 'It's taken care of, he's defeated.' What did you mean by that?" Just marking my new turf. I had to let him know who rolls the roost. There's only one top dog in any pack, baby, and I'm going to make sure I'm yours." "Steve, what did you do?" "I punched him in the nose, roughed him up a little. It was really no big deal." "Steve, the police left a message on my machine. Kyle was badly hurt." "Not by me, baby," Steve lied. "He was awake and moaning when I left. Maybe he got hurt after getting drunk, or had a burglar beat him after we left. We have to go back." "No way," he answered. "We have 2 more days of sunning and drinking and 2 more nights of drilling to do." "Steve, this is serious. Kyle was badly injured, and the police will be suspicious that I wasn't there, and wasn't in contact. It's not going to look good if you hit him. He turns up beaten, and we don't come back. You want to trade 2 nights of fucking for 2 years in jail?" She scurried into the house, and packed both of their bags. When she came out, Steve had packed his most important personal items, his dumbbells, into the trunk of his car. "Okay, you may have a point," he said. "Let's go." They tossed the bags in back, locked the cabin, and raced south. "Kyle? Kyle? Get Dr. Kenton, he's waking up." "Kyle." His vision flickered and was greeted by the harsh fluorescent tubes of the lights in the hospital recovery room. It was hard to focus, and he was quite confused. "Only one, I was working." He tried to rise, but was restrained, and he immediately began to struggle against the restraints. "Easy, easy, Kyle. You've been in rough shape, but we'll get you through it. Don't fight us. We're on your side." He relaxed onto the bed and regarded the post-op nurse who was talking to him. "Dr. Kenton will be right here and explain everything." "What's wrong with my eye?" Kyle was alarmed as he realized as I was heavily bandaged. "It was badly hurt, but I have to wait and let the doctor talk to you." "Stay calm, he'll be right here." Indeed, the doctor arrived very shortly. He examined Kyle as he explained his injuries. Kyle had been beaten. His eye was bandaged because it had taken at least one serious blow. An optical surgeon had repaired the detached retina, but work had to be done to repair fractures of the skull around the eye socket as well. He had suffered a pretty severe concussion as a result of the blow that had caused these injuries, and they were very glad to see that he still had control of speech. Kyle's arm was severely broken and in a cast. He had nearly died as a result of a ruptured spleen and internal hemorrhaging. If his neighbor had been an hour later in finding him, he wouldn't have survived. His nose was broken, along with several ribs. He had been unconscious for 2 days since he was discovered, and they were still trying to determine the time of his attack in order to gauge how long he had been lying unattended. "I don't remember an attack." The doctor frowned and began to ask questions of Kyle. When he realized that Kyle couldn't remember any of the circumstances surrounding the weekend or the Friday before, he began to ask general questions. When finished, Dr. Kenton knew that Kyle couldn't remember anything that had happened since his freshman year. Before meeting Jeannie, Kyle's attack had left him with severe memory loss, and only time would tell how soon it might return. Detective Porter, who had been assigned the task of investigating Kyle's case, was visibly disturbed. His timeline of the incidents leading up to the attack had reached a dead end at last Friday, when Kyle had deactivated the home security. Or did he deactivate them? Kyle and Jeannie met in college. They were both enrolled in theater programs and drama schools in New York, right in the heart of one of the most active theater communities in the world. She was studying to be an actress, learning how to create the illusion of a story on the stage. She was wonderful, but somehow, she had difficulty taking direction, and much preferred to give it. Her teachers noticed this, and noticed how creative her ideas could be. They began to groom her for a career as a director or in theater management. Kyle was into the backstage magic of the theater. He didn't have to create illusions as an actor did. He created different realities through sound, lights, effects, and his set designs. He made it so the actor's job was easy for an audience to believe. Kyle was immediately recognized as brilliant. He was one of those rare talents who understood all the aspects of technical theater, and was as comfortable designing a lighting look as he was a sound plot. They met when they were both hired to do a summer stop project up in Connecticut the summer after their junior year. Jeannie was brought there as stage manager for her mentor and professor, who had just been hired as the director for 2 of the company's 4 summer productions. Kyle had worked there for 2 previous summers as a house electrician, but this year had become the assistant lighting director and had the opportunity to design one of the shows. Working closely together, the two were instantly attracted to each other. These would be their first of many productions together, both as students and later as they built careers in the field. Jeannie was a slender, willowy vision, with a killer smile beneath her deep brown eyes. She was deliciously curvy where it counted, but without a speck of extra weight. Her long tan legs poked out from the shorts she always wore, and her talks were conservative enough to say, "Please behave," while just revealing enough to say, "I may have a surprise for you." Kyle was dashingly handsome. He was an avid runner, an amateur boxer, claiming his best ideas came during his morning road work once his brain was cleared of the mishmash of day-to-day distraction. He looked like he worked out regularly, but really didn't need to. The day-to-day lifting and climbing he had to do was a perfect replacement for the weight training his friends advocated. He was fit and trim, and reasonably sure that if he kept doing the work of realizing his plots even when he was the designer, he would stay that way for life. They began to look for opportunities to be together. Senior year had been a blur. Kyle saw Jeannie regularly, and their love grew daily. Both of their careers were already established by the end of the year, with Kyle working regularly as designer at several small suburban houses and frequently backstage at downtown theaters for established designers. Jeannie landed a job backstage at one of the large opera company's residence at Lincoln Center, a steady job with great benefits she could keep for life. They shared a small apartment around the corner from her theater and enjoyed the bustling performing arts scene in the city. He remembered the tender moments they shared. She was a tasteful decorator and a master shopper, and had done their apartment up in such a chic manner they had become a popular hangout for their friends. He was a gourmet cook, and whether making a dinner for themselves and company, or just for candlelight on the two of them, he always had her eyes rolling in delight over his delicious cooking. In his bed, Kyle could remember his wedding. In vivid detail, the ceremony in the small church came streaming back. He could hear the small organ playing Bach, and smell the distinct aroma of the beeswax candles burning at the altar as his eyes watered at the luscious sight of his bride walking towards him smiling. He could taste the delectable meal at the little Greek restaurant where they had their wedding feast. They had danced, and then hugged their family and friends as they left for the Little Inn where they would spend their wedding night. It was perfect. The room was lit by the fire and a brick hearth just beyond the foot of their bed. They stood beside the flickering flames and kissed. Dr. Kindon came by on his evening rounds. He was pleased to see Kyle remembering events up to his wedding, but there was still a 15-year gap. He agreed to give Kyle some information, as long as Kyle received it calmly. "You are still married to Jeannie, according to the neighbor who found you and saved your life. You are still working as a freelance theater designer, and do quite well. You own a fine home very near this hospital. You and your wife have had no children, but otherwise are the stereotypical happy couple living the American dream." The doc went on to explain the seriousness of Kyle's injuries again, now that Kyle seemed more alert and lucid. They had all confidence that he would recover fully from everything. He went into medical explanations of each injury in detail, and Kyle heard nothing but blah blah blah. Kyle's bandages were removed from his eye Friday morning. His body clock was finally freeing itself from the effects of his trauma and the anesthesia for his surgeries. He was alert and flirting with his nurses. Repeated interviews with the police had yielded nothing yet, which frustrated Detective Porter. Kyle was pleased to have remembered his pleasant home life with Jeannie, his work on shows up until about a year ago. He also remembered some sort of big project with his studio. There was something that involved his recording rig, something about sound effects. It nagged at him, but he couldn't get a clear sense of what it meant. He also remembered an intense pain. Somehow, it felt related to the pains in his head, but he couldn't place how. He slept easily Friday night, knowing he'd be able to go home Saturday. As Kyle was falling asleep, Jeannie arrived home to a dark house. Steve carried her bag in for her, and both were stunned to see the notice taped to the door that the area had been a crime scene, but that processing was complete, and occupants could return. Inside, Jeannie froze at the sight of a large pool of dried blood on the hallway floor where Kyle had lay. She looked at Steve. Just a punch in the nose, huh? Steve blanched. In his rage, he may have gone a little overboard, and if he left Kyle in a critical state without aid, he could be charged with something more than a simple assault. His mind searched for an explanation. It wasn't his mind that he had exercised to a precision machine. We can't tell the cops I hid in. Steve said. We have to tell them I left first, carrying your bag to the car, and that he was fine when you left. This is bad, Steve. This is very bad. Jeannie, stick to the story, we'll be okay. We'll look like heels for leaving and not being here for him, but they can't pin anything on us. Us. Jeannie was incredulous. I was in the car. Anything that gets pinned on anything will be on your sorry hide, not mine. Separating from Kyle, even divorcing him is one thing. Going to jail for beating him is another. You were with me, baby. And you heard me say he was defeated. You were in this with me. I may not be the smartest guy on the block, but I know what an accomplice is. She thought about it, and realized Steve was right. She wouldn't be able to explain their abrupt departure away, unless they claimed they left Kyle in good shape, leaving the possibility that someone else had come in and beaten him. How did she get into this mess anyway? She agreed with Steve, and they set their story straight. By the time they had decided what to say, it was nearly midnight. She called Detective Porter, and he told them he would meet them at the police station immediately. This was an urgent matter and couldn't wait until morning. Jeannie wanted to go to the hospital first, but Detective Porter was insistent. He told her that Kyle was medically out of the woods and was probably resting. He pointed out that she hadn't been in a hurry to see Kyle when he was in critical condition, and even tonight she had gone home rather than directly to the hospital. There was no reason to disturb his rest, which was badly needed for his recovery. There were questions that needed to be answered. Jeannie didn't respond until the detective offered to have a patrolman pick her up and drive her. She and Steve got in the car and headed to the station. They were questioned separately, but both had rehearsed their story. They didn't offer much, relying on a lot of "I don't know." They did admit they had been at the house and seen Kyle. They admitted he had been very distraught when they had left, but that he was physically unharmed. Porter didn't believe them, but had no evidence to prove his hunch. He was aware that Kyle was being released from the hospital today, so he decided to hold the two in lockup until Kyle had a chance to get settled, and until Porter could warn him his wife was coming home. It might also give Steve and Jeannie a chance to believe the other had rolled and given up the truth, and maybe they could get them to talk more freely. Porter was waiting when Dan, Kyle's neighbor, brought him home. Kyle got out gingerly, still very sore from his savage attack. He waved Porter into the house. Dan's wife Kim had been over earlier and cleaned up the hallway. The house was beautiful and inviting, and something smelled delicious. She smiled as she came out of the kitchen, inviting everyone to the table for a home-cooked welcome home meal. Though Kyle appreciated Kim's efforts, especially cleaning up the reminders of the incident, he was uneasy being home. He could now remember events that happened last week, right up until the day of the incident, and not having those last pieces frustrated him. Kim and Dan cleaned up the kitchen and said their goodbyes. They had worked out a schedule with some of the other neighbors to drop in every hour or two and make sure he was okay, at least over the weekend. They made certain he knew that if he needed anything, he should call right away. As they left, Detective Porter looked at Kyle and said, "She'll be home soon, you know." "I know. She was here already." Kyle nodded at Jeannie's bag by the door. "I know. I held them today, just to make sure you were squared away and ready to meet her. He'll probably be with her. I'm ready." Detective Porter noted the resolve in Kyle's voice and the determination in his eyes. "I want to show you something." Kyle led Porter into the studio. Porter was impressed with the array of sound gear, digital imaging equipment, and computer gear in the row. Kyle led into a computer workstation connected to a large mixing board. "This is my main audio recording rig. I have all kinds of interesting files on here. Some of them I forgot, until just a minute ago. For the last day or two a memory has been nagging at me. There was something about a project I was working on, but couldn't remember. When Dan and Kim left, it reminded me of another couple leaving the house, the couple that left the house last Friday just before I was attacked. It is possible I was recording something when they came to call and neglected to turn the recorder off. It is possible there is an audio file on here that would explain things to you, in case something happens to me. It is possible that I recorded everything from the time Jeannie and Steve left here until the recording reached my preset limit, which was set to 12 hours. I should just take that into our lab. I wish you wouldn't. I'd be happy if you let me fight my own battles." Detective Porter regarded Kyle. He wasn't suspicious. He didn't have to be, because he knew Kyle's intent was to return the thrashing and humiliation Steve had generously lavished on him last week. Kyle, I love to watch a good bare-knuckled fight. Unfortunately, I'd have to arrest both the participants and witnesses. I also love to see an underdog come back strong and take back what he lost. Steve is a big guy and works out hard at the gym. It won't matter. Kyle smiled. Hey, what I don't know won't hurt me. Just give yourself time to heal a bit longer. Porter smiled. Kyle nodded. Detective Porter wished him the best and made sure Kyle had his phone number on his cell's speed dial. Steve brought Jeannie home from the county lockup that evening. Her hair was mussed and her clothing was disheveled. They both came into the house, but Steve waited by the door while she came alone into the living room. Hi, she said meekly. Kyle just looked at her, expressionless. I heard you were hurt, so I came home early. Inside, he was exploding. He wanted in the worst way to jump out of the chair and berate her for her feigned concern, for coming home a whole 2 days early from a trip she shouldn't have taken to have an affair he didn't understand and couldn't condone. But outwardly he showed nothing but cool. That's right. She was surprised at his lack of emotion. After a scene telling her to stay, she expected more. Are you okay? No. I'll heal. We have to talk. No, we don't. We talked last week. Kyle, we can't just let this fester in our minds. You have to talk this through with me. I need to know what to expect. Expect to separate, then divorce. Expect to go away from me and never be welcome back. Expect me to treat you with the respect any other human deserves, but without the love and care I felt for you a week ago. Well, part of this was as she had expected, but she hadn't expected him to be so cool and calm. So she would stay a couple of days, and then move out once she had her affairs in order. She set her bag down and turned to sit. I said you're leaving. She turned to look at him quizzically. I meant now. Go. I don't think you understand what's going on here. I may have offended you, and I may have ended our marriage, but I have given up no rights to my home or belongings. I'll move into the guest room, but I'm staying here until I get my things together and move out. Before she could continue her tirade, Kyle clicked a remote in his hand. The whole house stereo he had installed sprang into action and played back a recording of last Friday's events. You could clearly hear her sarcastically belittling him as she told him she was going on a vacation with a real man, and that he couldn't stop her. You could hear Steve laughing as she told Kyle she planned to fuck and suck Steve all week, or even longer until she was satisfied. You could hear Kyle trying to stop her one last time. Her heels clicked noisily on the floor as she left, with Steve saying tough luck little whip. After the door slammed shut you could hear it open again, with Jeannie calling come on Steve in the distance. He called back to her, and then you can clearly hear him say to Kyle, just so there are no ideas about following us, or trying to stop us. This was followed by the sickening sounds of Kyle being pummeled by Steve. You could hear Steve grunt as he kicked Kyle repeatedly in the ribs, and worse you could hear him taunting Steve, telling him how he was going to beat the shit out of him today, and then fuck the shit out of Jeannie that night. On the way out, Steve left a parting blow. Now your head is as broken as your whip-assed heart. You just lay there in your blood and think for an hour or two. You'll realize she needs the big dog to make her happy. But she'll come back to you when she realizes the big dog can't stay with any one bitch for long. Kyle looked at a mortified Jeannie. Steve came around the doorframe scowling at Kyle. Why you little conniving pansy? Kyle stopped him by waving one finger. Porter doesn't have the recording, but he'll get it if I want him to. There is a video that was shot by the camera right over your head. If the audio does not work, the video will surely land you in jail for attempted murder. I don't want him to put you in jail. I want a rematch. Jeannie was horrified. Steve grinned from ear to ear. I propose a wager. You both have to accept, and your terms are different, or there is no deal, and Porter gets a sound file in 10 minutes via email. 6 weeks month from today, once this cast is off my arm and my ribs have healed. You can't win. Steve shook his head as he spoke. No, I couldn't win after that cheap shot last week. This time we fight, fair and square. No sneaking up from behind a cold cock and unsuspecting victim. You coward. You're going to see me coming and not be able to stop me any more than I could stop you lying there unconscious last week. Are you sure you can win under those terms? Bare-fisted, man to man, no weapons. I'll rip you up. Bet your gem. Steve looked at him again. He wasn't prepared to risk anything of that magnitude. He owned the gym, and the building it was in, lock, stock, and barrel. The building had several offices which were lucrative tenants, and was an incredible cash cow. His apartment took up the top floor of the building, and was a luxurious space with views overlooking Long Island Sound. But Steve didn't believe this guy could be no match for a fit lifter like himself. Sure, David beat Goliath, but David had a sling. But all your gems. Steve paused to think of his expanding business. Not only did he have his flagship club, but had built 6 satellites around town, and they were flourishing to a point that he was considering selling franchises. What? But all that against your house and all this nifty electronic gear. Are you nuts? No, my house and gear are not on the table. You are betting against this recording and all copies. You are betting against jail time and losing all of your property later in civil court. You are betting your businesses, your real estate. Silence hung over the room as Steve realized he would be fighting for his own freedom. And your cars? Steve had several vintage and late model Corvettes, one from every decade back to the 50s. They were his pride and joy, and the entire town knew it. It made the stakes incredibly high, but Steve thought Kyle was nothing. Done. And the cabin at the lake. Fine, fine, you hold all the cards, don't you? I'll risk it all. But there's really no risk. I'll thrash you. Kyle looked at Jeannie. She had listened to him catalog stakes to Steve, and now braced herself to hear her risk. If I win, I want it all and I want you gone. No contesting the divorce, no taking anything from this house or our cottage, and not a dime from our bank account or investments. You have to watch every minute of the fight. You also have to live with Steve until the fight, and if I win, he can still have you. You are useless to me. Jeannie trembled, but nodded her agreement. She knew Steve was strong. But she also knew how in shape Kyle was, how much he ran, his history as a boxer. She had seen him manhandle reels of cable and links of pipe backstage that typically took two guys to move. Kyle. He looked at her with that same blank expression, and again it made her queasy to not be able to read him. What if I'd rather bet on you? You already made that choice last week. This week your choice is freedom or jail. I made my choice the day you walked out of the door. The weeks passed quickly, and Kyle spent them building his strength back. He had begun to take lighting projects again. His absence from the scene had left a bit of a hole, and his return was widely welcomed. He was asked about his attack at every turn, but refused to give details. The circumstances surrounding his wife were the source or a torrent of rumors. It was widely known that she was now living with Steve. There were those who suspected the truth, and were waiting to see what Kyle would do about it. He was known for a tenacious personality, and none of these people believed he would suffer the indignity of a beating and the taking of his wife without reaction. The stories that Jeannie had abandoned Kyle in his darkest hour, and the fact that he was so well-liked had made her a pariah in the theater scene. The night of the fight arrived. Kyle walked into the gym in a t-shirt and sweats. Steve was already by the ring, clad in ridiculous-looking boxing shorts and a muscle shirt emblazoned with the logo of the gym. Jeannie sat sullenly at a table, holding an envelope containing Steve's titles and contracts, to stakes in the bed. Steve was surrounded by many of his friends, and all of his gym staff and clients. They were all egging him on, cheering, and teasing him about the light work he was about to take on. They teased even harder when Kyle entered the room. Kyle in his lithe runner's body looked like no match for Steve's bulging hard body. Kyle walked straight past Jeannie and dropped his folio containing his contracts and the recording on the table next to Steve's. As he climbed into the ring he said, "Let's go. No bells, no refs, no stopping until one of us is beaten." Steve grinned and lumbered to the ropes, climbed in, and offered his hand to Kyle. Kyle looked at it, and without taking it, threw a jab at Steve's nose. Steve looked up, stunned, with a trickle of blood leaking out of his right nostril. "No bells," Kyle said as he stunned Steve again. The impressive bulk of Steve's physique made him look great, but he wasn't as flexible as Kyle. His stiff frame slowed down his reaction time, as he moved poorly compared to Kyle's light-footed bobbing and weaving. Steve lumbered after Kyle, but just couldn't make his big body react fast enough to pin down the speedy Kyle. Every time he got close enough to hit his opponent, Kyle made him pay with a flurry of jabs to the face. It didn't take long before Steve's face was swollen, and he slowed in his attempts to bulldoze Kyle into a corner. Steve soon realized that in the center of the ring he was no better off. Kyle didn't look that big, but he also was a short man, and had a sizable advantage in reach. He also wasn't slowing down, while Steve was getting tired from throwing so many haymakers, the best of which barely grazed their target. As Steve grew weary, Kyle began to connect to his body. It didn't take long before Steve's hands grew heavy and dropped. Kyle picked him apart. 15 seconds later, Kyle opened a huge gash Steve's forehead, then a giant blob under his right eye. "Give it up, Steve. You can barely stand. You can't defend. You've lost." Steve looked up at him, panting heavily. Both eyes were swollen, and blood was oozing from his nose and a nasty cut beneath the one eye that could still see. "Give it up now, and I'll leave you with more than you deserve. Apologize in front of everyone here. Do it now, and I'll just take this gym, this building, and the 58 convertible. You keep the rest. If you don't give up now, I'll knock you out and keep it all." Steve knew he was beaten. His head was down already when his body sunk to its knees. "I apologize." Kyle went to the table and fished out the deeds to the building, the gem, and the title to the 58 vet. Keys in hand, he looked at the unbelieving assembly of Steve's friends and associates. "I'm closing the gym and opening a theater school here. I will honor employment contracts you have with Steve, but will expect you to work for me in a useful capacity. If he transfers you to one of his other gyms, I will release you from your contractual obligations here. For those of you who are tenants in the building, I will honor your leases and will treat you fairly in negotiations when they are out. There will be a different atmosphere here, however, as this room will be renovated into a theater. Should you choose to vacate your leases due to this change, I will release you." Jeannie stared incredulously at Kyle. They had long shared the dream of establishing a community of theater professionals and amateurs alike, dedicated to furthering the state of theater arts. He was not only establishing their dream without her, he had the resources to do it because of her betrayal. She felt left out entirely, and suddenly very lonely and cold. The color drained from her face, she stared at a beaten Steve. His face lacked no pigment whatsoever, as it was already blackening with bruises and red with blood from the cuts that his friends were just bandaging. Steve never looked so pitiful, so broken. Kyle never looked so bold. There was no gloating, no arrogance, just the cold confidence with which he did everything. 6 months later, Jeannie was still living with Steve. Neither had been interested in the other sexually since the fight. Still, they had to live together. It was a cold coexistence, as each believed the other was the reason for the failure of their fortunes. Steve never tried to contest the arrangement with Kyle, is held on to as part of the deal. Kyle did pay some money to Steve to make it look like a business deal. Although, the money was just 1% of the total valuation of the property. Jeannie had quickly and quietly moved from her home, which was now entirely Kyle's. The divorce was finalized long ago. Kyle didn't speak to her since the fight, and didn't return calls the few times she had tried to call. Steve had worked to continue to build his business, but growth had slowed as word of his failure in the ring spread. He was saving what he had by offering membership packages designed more for the elderly and moms who didn't work outside of the home. 2 of his satellite gyms had closed, the rest had lost much of their glamour. He had lost his penthouse apartment when he lost his building to Kyle, and had to move into a little condo near one of his remaining gyms that now served as his flagship. His fighter wasn't so bold now, and often was completely missing. Instead of the aura of confidence he exuded before the entire episode with Kyle, he appeared considerably less formidable. His mood was frequently sullen, and he worried continually about finances, as he no longer had the rents from his downtown building to support his other ventures. Kyle had successfully converted the main gym to a marvelous theater space. He had converted smaller areas into rehearsal spaces, shops, and dressing rooms. He carved out room for an intimate little cabaret theater, and on the first floor opened a coffee house with a small stage. A summer season was already planned, and the town was buzzing with excitement about the possibilities Kyle was proposing for actors and audiences of all ages. As was his intention, Kyle had been so intently busy setting up shop, it almost seemed as if he had forgotten the entire attack which took place not even a year ago. He still remembered vividly, though. He remembered every night when he walked through his own front door. He remembered every night when he fell asleep in his lonely room. He remembered every time he entered a theater where he and Jeannie had collaborated on a project. As hard as he tried, he couldn't avoid the memories of sharing a half a lifetime, and still not knowing the woman he had considered the love of his life. He was working on a light plot at home in his studio one night when the doorbell rang. It was Jeannie's brother, Peter. Peter lived in Boston, and rarely left that city. He had, in fact, only visited Jeannie twice during the entire time she and Kyle were together. His presence meant something was wrong. "Hi, Kyle. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I really need to talk to you about my sister. Would you mind if I came in?" Sensing urgency in Peter's words, Kyle stepped aside and ushered him to the living room. He offered a cup of coffee or a beer, but Peter declined. "I'd really like to get right to the reason I came to see you. I'm really sorry things worked out so badly between you two. I thought you were a great couple and want you to know our entire family was shocked by my sister's sudden change of heart. She is committed to keeping her part of the bargain. She knows she was foolish to give you up for a fling, but her life with Steve just isn't right. She chose Steve over me," Kyle muttered. "It just seemed appropriate that she get exactly what she wanted. She chose a fling. She was wrong and betrayed you miserably, and nobody blames you for how you responded. She was foolish, but living with Steve is torture, and now he has made it physical. He hit her and broke her nose last night." Kyle was not pleased to hear Jeannie was being abused. He wanted her to have to live with Steve's stupidity, with his early American jock decor, with the life of a full-time gym rat. He wanted her to be disgusted with Steve's sexist comments and expectations, with his selfish attitudes, with his inexhaustible vanity. However, Kyle agreed to help. Kyle and Peter drove to Steve. Kyle pulled up behind Peter's car. He walked right into Steve's house like he owned it. Steve didn't exactly like this move, but wasn't in much of a position to object. He had hit Jeannie, and now was here with her brother and the guy that had publicly whipped him. Either of them could send him to jail for abuse now, and Peter was using that angle like a slave driver. Steve was carrying Jeannie's things to the car. Peter had helped him pack, but Steve was doing the carrying. There wasn't much, as her part of the divorce agreement had left her just a couple of keepsakes and her clothing. Steve came back inside from the last trip. He began to speak. "Don't say a word." Kyle was seething. "You know what has to happen now, right?" Steve didn't want to hear it. "You broke her nose. You hit a little woman and messed up her face by breaking her nose. Stand up." Steve looked at him, but stood obediently. Kyle stood too. He stepped close to Steve, and before either Steve or Peter could predict what might happen, Kyle broke Steve's nose with a swift right. Kyle's sign of forgiving of Jeannie was taken as a signal by his neighbors, family, and the theater community. She was welcomed back into those circles in almost the same stature she had enjoyed all those months ago, even though no one forgot where she had been. Steve sold his businesses, and after a period of reflection, discovered he didn't like the jerk he'd been. He finally put the degree in PE he'd earned in college to use, taking a job at a local elementary school. He developed a soft spot for working with kids with physical handicaps and other special needs. He has become a Special Olympics coach and volunteers with the physical therapy department of a local children's hospital. Kyle's theater project thrived, and his programs were accredited by a local university. His programs for school children are highly regarded and have become very profitable. His professional productions play to packed houses and have drawn the attention of top New York critics who usually don't stray too far from Broadway houses. Kyle and Jeannie lived close by each other, but rarely spoke. She had been the love of his life, and he couldn't see her in complete ruin, beaten and shunned by the community that ran the profession she lived for. Once he had set her out safely, he wanted nothing more from her. He dealt with her professionally. After all, she was good at what she did, and was a tremendous asset to his company. He could not, however, see her in any other light, and rarely even spoke with her on the level of a friend. Jeannie accepted her position in Kyle's life as a blessing. She wasn't in jail, she was working, and she was able to make amends with Kyle in at least a small way. She felt living near to him with no chance of his ever again loving her was better than the alternative. There was no way to really make anything up to him, but perhaps, if she stayed here until she saw him happily settled with a new love, and maybe a family, she could be at peace. It was inevitable. Kyle fell in love with a divorced woman he met at the Cape. She summered in a neighboring cottage with her brother's family and her young daughter. She moved in with Kyle that fall, and they were married that October in a beautiful, but small ceremony in Kyle's backyard. Jeannie had declined the invitation to attend, but had watched the event from her bedroom window, the only one with a view. She cried bitter tears as she remembered the events that had brought her to this point, and now the last chapter was complete. Her tears landed on her last little suitcase. She had already loaded the rest in the rental car that sat outside of the garage. When the party moved into Kyle's house for dinner, Jeannie grabbed her bag and got in her car. She took one last look at Kyle's house before she drove off. She knew he would find the goodbye letter she had left on his desk once he returned from his honeymoon. She checked her carry-on one more time to make sure she had her ticket and passport and her signed contract for her new job as a stage manager in London. Kyle had his new life now. She shed one last tear and left to find hers. Dear listener, if you have reached this far, please click on the subscribe button. It will be a great help.